Welcome back to our section on poverty, inequality, and discrimination. We left off talking about the war on poverty, finding unfortunately, since it was implemented, which on this graph, right, it was implemented in 65, but knowing the delay it takes for government programs to have an impact, maybe 67, 68, when it would have set in, and there's not evidence that the poverty line itself decreased over time, unfortunately. So, 2010, what are we looking at for poverty rates? It certainly differs across group. This in and of itself is not going to mean there's discrimination, but the poverty rate does vary wildly depending on the particular group. Now, if you recall though from the very first exercise, the question, how easy is it to get poor? It ties in a lot to working. Right? If you're working full-time, it's extraordinarily difficult for you to be under the poverty line. Almost impossible. So this is going to tie into a lot on who isn't working. So what are some problems measuring inequality or even issues with poverty? One, poverty rate. The poverty rate, in-kind transfers aren't included, which you could question whether that's right or not. There are reasons for it, but anybody who receives anything other than cash, so housing assistance, food stamps, isn't included in a person's income, so the poverty rate, say maybe it's too high relative to what some might think it should be. Second factor, life cycle of poverty, right? This is the idea of how long the idea second measure is the life cycle of poverty. For every individual, income's going to vary over a lifetime. Well, people can borrow and save to offset changes in income over a lifetime. I suspect as college students, many of you are borrowing right now because you're making less money than normal in the expectation that you're going to make more money once you graduate, and that's a very realistic expectation. Others save throughout their lives, and then they don't work during retirement and live off of those savings. That has a pretty big impact, right? It means there's going to be income differences and perhaps poverty showing up in the statistics sometimes, but not going to be a variation in living standards, which is probably the more important item, right? I mean, that's a little bit of normative on what is more important, what should be considered more important. But how well a person lives, I suspect most people would say that is more important than how much income do they have in a particular year. If you're very wealthy one year and not very wealthy the other, your living standards likely could be pretty reasonable both years. Related to the last point, transitory versus permanent income. There's a temporary income spike. It's not a permanent income spike. Current income's usually better, usually not as ideal as what we would think of as a permanent income, right? If you have 1 year where you make a whole lot more money, unless you expect that to happen every single year, you'd be smart not to spend all of that, but perhaps to save so you could live a little bit better off many years. Or perhaps buy an investment that will last you many years beyond the initial year. If you say, have a big spike in income and use that to buy a new vehicle, pay in cash, and that will last a number of years. That would be an idea of smoothing out an income fluctuation because it's not going to just last you year one. It can last you years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and more. Fourth idea of measuring problem, the title says inequality, but I think poverty matches this perfectly fine. The idea of economic mobility. Many people do move between income classes. So right now, many of you would be actually considered in poverty, or in the bottom 20% 20th percentile because you're not really earning any money. 10 years from now, you might be in the top 20th percentile, depending how well you do, 5 or 10 years from now. So people often move across among income classes. And in fact, the U.S. incomes are pretty mobile. So there is a fair amount of income mobility where people who are in the bottom 1 year may 10 years later be in the, say, 60th to 80th percentile of income, or maybe even in the top 20th percentile. Our current statistics don't measure between those who are temporarily poor and those who are persistently poor. So the income mobility is more of a normative view on whether this is more problematic, but I think most people tend to think a college student being in poverty is not as problematic as somebody who's persistently in poverty. So the statistic here, 55% of those in the bottom 20th percentile of earnings move to a higher income within 20 years. It's a website if you want to look at more on that. If you just Google income mobility, though, you'll find all sorts of links on how mobile individuals' incomes are. So should incomes be redistributed? And what are some philosophies behind the idea of redistributing income? The incomes are earned in the U.S. they're mostly earned by market-based mechanisms. There's certainly some government intervention, but even among college majors, if you are you're a music or sociology major, your expected starting income is going to be a lot different than if you're an economics, finance, or accounting major. Well, that's the way the market dictates the value on the particular skills. That information is available to everybody going into college. So that's the way things are right now in terms of demand and supply and what people wish to do. And so what about redistributing income? Well, 3 general philosophies that we'll talk about: utilitarianism, liberalism, and libertarianism. Starting with utilitarianism, it's the idea of let's maximize the happiness of all of society. Well, we know that there's diminishing marginal utility, right? So if you're given $10,000, it's going to mean a lot more to you if you only have $10,000 relative to if you have $100,000, right? There's a huge difference in what that next $10,000 will mean to you, just like the idea of diminishing marginal utility. If you eat the first piece of pizza, the second shouldn't be as important to you. The same should hold as income. Well, under this idea of diminishing marginal utility, if some money taken from those who are wealthier given to somebody who's poorer should increase the overall happiness in society. This would not necessarily mean incomes are equal, but it would indicate that some role for the government in redistributing income, or having those who are wealthier pay slightly higher tax rates and those who are less wealthy receiving perhaps some either monetary or in-kind transfers from the government. Liberalism, the idea, this is John Rawls, who thought, think if somebody's behind a veil of ignorance, they want everybody to be, they might argue that society's only as good as the worst off person. Liberalism still may not call for a complete equalization of incomes, but often calls for more redistribution than utilitarianism. So this falls into the idea of social insurance. Government aims at protecting people against the risk of adverse effects in a personal life. So you'd certainly with this have income redistribution again, and even more of it than under just utilitarianism. Okay, our third kind of viewpoint on how the government should get involved is libertarianism. This is the government should be going after crimes and enforcing agreements, but not be in the business of redistributing income at all. Libertarianism, you focus more on the process. Is the process fair? If the process is fair, outcomes are going to be unequal, but that shouldn't matter as much, right? As long as the process is fair and everybody has an equal opportunity under the process, the government shouldn't interfere even though you're going to end up with unequal incomes. Some comparisons. The US is much better off in terms of the impoverished households now compared to the past. And look at some simple things: air conditioning, color televisions, home ownerships, all very well, much, much, much higher than what they were in the past. So this raises a normative question of how much to interfere in redistribute incomes, and probably your view on these questions would likely determine how much of a utilitarianism philosophy you follow, liberalism philosophy, or libertarianism philosophy. Should somebody who spends money on cable television and a cell phone plan, which are definitely viewed at least as very extraneous luxuries a few years ago at the very minimum, should they get food stamps income redistribution? Your view on that might largely dictate what your thoughts are on, are you a libertarian, liberal, or utilitarianist? Okay, a little bit about income inequality. Incomes are very unequal within the United States. So the bottom fifth of incomes, so the bottom 20th percentile in households earning income in the United States earn under $20,000 a year, whereas the top 20% earn over $100,000 per year, with the top 5% being over $180,000. And you can see the various distributions within the middle. The median income, household income, you see various statistics. Usually it's in about 50,000 or so, a little bit lower, a little bit higher, depending on the exact agency that's estimating it for household income in the United States. Taking a measure where you take the income of the top 20% divided by the top 20% divided by the bottom 20%. See that inequality has risen in the United States in the past 30 years, had fallen from 50 to 1980 and risen again a little bit. So incomes within the United States have become more unequal, and generally are a little bit more unequal with some other countries in the world, as we're about to see. Not all countries, right? There are some countries that are more unequal than the U.S., but for developed countries, the U.S. generally is a little bit more unequal income, has more unequal income distributions than many other countries, including, as you see, the UK, Canada, Germany, Japan. So should income inequality be corrected? This is obviously a normative question. Normative questions won't be tested, but we have some idea, if you're going to say yes versus no, what you might argue for your points. So if you say yes, you're probably more likely to say, well, yes, there's the diminishing marginal utility of wealth idea, and let's prevent poverty. If you say no, you're like, the government's horrendously inefficient. We don't want them doing anything. You take away economic freedom if you correct for inequality, and you probably also look at the life cycle idea. Consumption inequality is often less than income inequality. So, once again, should it be corrected or not, that's not going to be asked on an exam ever, at least by me. I don't think it should be asked by any economics professor. But the kind of some of the thought process for those who might say yes and those who might say no, that you should know.